All right, guys, so video 3 of 5, and this one is in reference to contracts and negotiations, and we're talking about for sale by owner versus listing with an agent. This particular video discusses contracts and it discusses negotiations and what the differences are between you doing it yourself versus having a professional doing it. So now, I'll mention this again as I mentioned in all my videos. If you haven't seen the other videos, you don't have to watch them in any particular order, but please feel free to go back and watch those videos. Trying to keep them all to about 4 to 5 minutes a pop. And they hopefully share enough information where you at least get a good grasp on the differences. But again, I can elaborate more. Just want to stay within the nuggets of information that are really going to help you and guide you in this decision that you're about to make. So that being said, I really want you guys to understand that when it comes to contracts and negotiations, there's a major difference there between using an agent and doing it yourself. First and foremost, I want to talk about emotion, right? When it comes to emotion, you're emotionally attached to your property. It's your home, right? And so obviously you want the most for your house. You want somebody who's going to treat your house well. You want someone that's going to all this stuff, right? And so when it comes to negotiating on the property, you tend to become a little bit more particular about who you're willing to work with and prejudge who it is that's coming in. Now, as realtors, for the most part, and this doesn't go across every market, but for the most part, we don't want our buyer and our sellers to communicate until the closing table or even after the closing. There's a reason for that. It's called emotions. We know this is a very emotional process, and so realtors can tend to keep kind of a level playing field and stay grounded so that as we negotiate through this deal, we can help and we can guide appropriately without the passion that's driven in the emotion. So that being said, that's one of the big ones, right? When it comes to contracts and negotiation, it's very hard when you're emotionally attached. Now, when you're not necessarily emotionally attached, when you're professional about it, you know where to be. So to give you an example, I've negotiated a property where it was a $1 million property, and I'm looking at the numbers and I'm saying this property is not worth $1 million. And so I tell my buyers it's not worth $1 million. We go in at a certain price, we go in significantly lower, and then I go back to the agent and I say, hey man, here's where it's at. And him and I are talking and we're going through this conversation, this dialogue about where the property should be priced. And then ultimately he says, without saying you're right, he says, I understand your perspective and I understand where you're coming from. I'll tell you what, just send me an offer and send me an email as to the justifications as to why you feel that number is appropriate, and I'll present it to my sellers. So he was more open to listening to where I was coming from because I was saying, hey, here's my data. Do you have data to prove otherwise? And so while he did have data, it wasn't significant enough to trump my data, if that makes sense. So I was able to negotiate. Again, this is a deal that's in progress, so I'm not going to give you details, but the reality is I'm able to offer much less now with my clients, get them a better deal on the property because ultimately that's what the property should be priced at. So that being said, when you're the homeowner and you're doing this negotiation, you're going to sit there and you're going to say, no, I know it's worth that. And you know what? Ultimately, the market might say, not really. I get where you came up with that number, but not really. So again, there's a lot of variables that go into play there, and so it's very difficult for you to negotiate when you're emotionally attached to the property. Also, when it comes to contracts, I want to mention there's a lot of lingo that goes into contracts that's very difficult. So like, I'll give you an example. I was talking to someone about what's called an escalation clause. They have no idea what that is. An escalation clause is pretty much stating that, hey, let's just assume I'm going to offer you $110,000 for this property. However, I'm going to put an escalation clause that says I will go up to 120 with increments of $300. So of the next highest offer. So let's assume I'm offering 110, but if you prove to me that you have a contract on the house for 112, I'm offering you 112,300. That's what an escalation clause is. Again, that's contractual, and it's very difficult for someone who's not in this industry to understand that. Another example is I have a deal where I had the buyer, the seller gives me a clause that says, hey, we want 5 days after closing to have occupancy of the property. The reason for that is they don't want the deal to fall through right before closing and then their client moved out a bunch of stuff. Now the deal falls through and now they got to move all their furniture back in, and that's a huge expense. So again, these are little things that, yes, you can do these two things based on this video. However, like that, there are hundreds contractually that can be done. So again, take the time to really understand those things if you're deciding to for sale by owner. But again, when it comes to those things, it's really hard unless you have an agent by your side that's really guiding you every step of the way.